The Charnel House, written and read by Christopher Halton. As a child, I was raised in a remote Cumberland stone house, reminiscent of a Pele-type structure called Pomeroy Hall. The property, so my family loved to remind me, was built by a distant ancestor named Sir Gilbert De Pomeroy as a fortified house in the 13th century, which protected a section of the border from marauding Scottish raiding parties who, without landowners like De Pomeroy, would pillage the English border of property and livestock. Of course, that all ended in the 17th century, and over the years the property was extended with wings all built with the same dark brown Cumberland stone, featuring thick walls designed to resist attack, although not as substantial as those found in a castle. For their part, the Scots were fearsome and reckless warriors who attacked, raped and pillaged without mercy, and as the De Pomeroys were wool merchants, sheep theft and the killing of the odd shepherd were a relatively common occurrence. Subsequently, I was told, any Scots taken as prisoners by the De Pomeroys were hanged, drawn and quartered, with their butchered remains displayed on posts near the border as a warning to those who crossed into England. Such was the hatred and contempt for human life during these turbulent centuries that the rule of civilized law was at times ignored to suit the agenda of the Scottish raiders and my ancestors. Of course, such tales had their consequences, with reported hauntings of shadow men in the courtyard, and the sound of screaming and pleading had been reported, due in part to the execution of prisoners taken from the frequent forays across the border. Gilbert was a fearsome warrior, and it was said that he had participated in the Crusades, where he had led the forces of Christendom in historic battles against the forces of Islam. And so the reputation of my family was such that even to the present day, travellers from across the border were loath to enter its domain, despite being at peace for 300 years. One might wonder that living in such a place during my childhood, with my parents and grandparents, would have exposed me to all sorts of ghouls haunting its walls, and yet, for me, it did not. I had a pleasant childhood with my own Nanny Simpkins and the family cook, Mrs. Ingram. The two maids, Jessie and Margaret, made my life as comfortable as possible in this cold, windswept location, and I wanted for naught. I moved away at the age of 10 to London, as my father, Sir David Pomeroy, was working as a banker for an old English banking family. Before our move, he used to commute to London by train and return each month for a few days' break. Mother would miss him terribly, and so my new life from country to city life became the norm until, many years after the Great War, I decided to return to the house to take up the reins of responsibility, as by then my father had died, and Mother no longer wanted the responsibility of administering the estate through a manager employed at the Hall. And so, at the age of 30, I, Sir David Pomeroy, returned to the Hall in May 1930 to take up residence on an estate that grazed over 1,000 sheep. The animals roamed the hillsides surrounding the Hall, while the lowland areas were dotted with clumps of forest, which was home to deer, and featured a rocky stream that meandered through the picturesque Cumberland landscape. By then I was married to Milly, a lady who had spent her entire life in London and, as such, had never left the city or its environs, and for her and our two children, Roger, aged 8, and Sylvia, aged 5, this was a whole new life which surprisingly perhaps they took to, like fish to water. The hall, although well maintained, was rather dated, and with 8 bedrooms, a dining hall, reception room, lounge and sitting room, it required considerable work and expense to modernize. The kitchen was old world but well equipped, and even had its own bread oven and dairy room, where everything needed for self-sufficiency was catered for. We decided to lightly modernize this area with new lighting and an oven. The kitchen cupboards were old but made of mellowed oak, which had faded to a beautiful golden hue over the years. The oak beam ceiling had many hooks holding immaculate handcrafted brass kitchenware that was many years old, and the ambience of the kitchen was warm and wholesome. Other parts felt less so, but we reasoned some improvements, and a lick of new paint would cure that. Having employed an architect to draft a new visualization for the place, we engaged a manager from nearby Carlisle, who in turn engaged a team of craftsmen, while we took temporary residence in a rather delightful 18th century townhouse in that city. The work on the house, as it transpired, was onerous, involving the installation of new mains water, drainage and electricity. By November, most of the work was completed. However, what was believed to be a stone wall sealing a tunnel was later discovered in the cellar when a builder accidentally dislodged a stone block into a dark chasm beyond. Following this discovery, I was contacted by telephone by my project manager John Millfield, who, in a seemingly nervous tone, requested that I attend the hall at the earliest opportunity. Having driven over in our Mercedes family saloon car, I was greeted at the entrance by Millfield, who, with a roll of papers that I presumed to be my architect's drawings, escorted me into the hall area. Apart from him, I saw no other workmen present on site and asked why this was so. He looked at me with a trembling voice and said, "The men have walked off site since the breach in the cellar wall was made." He nervously paused and said, "They claim dark grey shadows of men haunt the place." I laughed and said, "This is preposterous. I lived here as a child, and there was nothing untoward that would suggest this." He replied, "You'd better follow me, Sir David, and you'll soon see why." With his head bowed, I followed this middle-aged, heavily built man wearing a brown raincoat and sporting a mop of brown, unruly hair, into the hall and down some stone steps into the cellar, where he rather quickly turned on a light switch which illuminated the arched walls and ceiling, from where I could see, some 20 feet away, a hole in a wall with broken stone lying asunder and intermingled with workers' tools, which looked as though they had been swiftly abandoned. "Good God!" I said in utter amazement. "What the hell has gone on here?" "Well, sir," he then ushered me with his hand to follow him to the debris and tools, whereupon he removed from the sagging left pocket of his coat an electric torch, which he shone into a broken, jagged void that breached into the wall. I stood alongside him as he passed me the torch, and saw through the blackness of the hole what appeared to be an ossuary with stone shelves, which neatly supported many human remains. I could see at least 20 skulls on one shelf, neatly stacked together and on top of each other, and below that, on another shelf, other bones lay neatly in an almost herringbone pattern across 2 lower shelves. The smell which permeated from there was ancient and appalling, and I could perfectly understand why any sane human being would run when confronted with this. But for shadows, the sight must have triggered appalling hallucinations, which in the circumstances were perfectly understandable. I ordered Millfield to help me remove the remaining stone from this enclave wall, and after an hour the work revealed a perfect entrance, upon which we entered, both of us rather in trepidation as to what we might discover within. Apart from our initial discovery, there were many other shelves in the room, 20 feet by 20 feet square, and we estimated at least 100 bodies of human remains lay within. All were neatly stacked in a way that suggested whoever did this took some great pleasure in the act of doing so. Among these were the bones of some women and children too, and I felt physically shocked and sickened to the point that I wanted to vomit. Here were the remains of a charnel house of some great antiquity, as also stacked neatly upon each other were rusted claymore swords and crude-looking shields. Additionally, some fragments of rotted tartan cloth lay on the ground, giving the impression that these had once been kilt cloth laid out like a carpet. I had my suspicions about who might be responsible, and Sir Gilbert's name came to mind immediately. I was hurt that my family name and family reputation were besmirched, and like Millfield, I was almost drawn to tears. I put my arm around his shoulder and led him back to the outside of the hall, where we both stood stunned for some minutes, sharing a cigarette each. Looking into his watery eyes, I said, "We must report this immediately to the authorities. These bones look centuries old, but we have to report this in order that these remains receive a decent Christian burial." He nodded quickly in agreement as he puffed heavily on his cigarette, and I immediately contacted the police by telephone, who shortly attended and, like us, were also visibly horrified. With the assistance of the police, the county coroner, Dr. J.B. Arrowsmith, attended, and over a period of 3 days, the total remains of 80 men, 7 children, and 25 women were removed by vans. Despite these being historic remains, a coroner's court was convened a month later, and all were discovered to have been the victims of being stabbed in the chest, or their heads were removed with an axe. By the remnants of items discovered and the method of execution, they were believed to be medieval ritual killings. As there were no living suspects, the case was closed, and the unnamed remains were buried in a specially prepared mass grave at the local church of St. John's in the village of Pomeroy, with a fitting service performed by both vicars of the Church of Scotland and the Church of England. As noble and honourable as I intended to rectify a wrong committed, I believe, by my ancestor, Sir Gilbert, my family naturally refused to live in the house, partly because of the discovery, and also because local gossip had declared the place haunted. I therefore came to an agreement with my family that if I proved the property to be cleansed of any alleged hauntings, had the hall blessed by a priest, and there were no further alleged occurrences, they would move in. And so, here are the results of that compact made with my family, which I will to this day never forget. My first act was to have the hall blessed and spiritually cleansed by Father McKinnon, a priest from a Catholic parish in Carlisle. He had, I was told, a history of performing exorcisms. In his early years he came from a tough Glaswegian estate in Scotland, and by nature was a hard and stoic man. During the interim I stopped all building work, which by now was largely cosmetic, and I moved back into the hall for a month to complete these tasks, as I feared losing my family over this historic tragedy. Father McKinnon was more than happy to help, partly because of the dilemma I was facing, and also as a moral act of duty for the many Scottish victims of Sir Gilbert. On a cold February afternoon in 1931, Father McKinnon arrived at the hall and intended, at my invitation, to stay for as long as was necessary to ensure that lost souls and evil had been cleared from the building. Arriving in a small Ford Prefect saloon with his assistant, a junior priest named Father Horace, I met them at the hall entrance and took them inside. Father McKinnon was a tall, well-built man of around 40 years who sported red hair and beard. Despite his rather tough demeanour, there was gentleness in his eyes which twinkled a warmth that I found reassuring. His assistant, Father Horace, was in his late 20s, slightly built and shorter than McKinnon. He was an Englishman who originated from Cheshire and was softly spoken with a clean-shaven face and brown, neatly trimmed hair. They appeared to work in unspoken harmony, the assistant now well accustomed to the grim rhythm of exorcisms and house purifications. Their bags held little more than essentials, and the sacred cloth they would soon lay out for the rite and some personal belongings. After settling into their rooms, we met later in the lounge in front of a roaring log fire, where I discussed the history of my family and the horrific discoveries in the cellar. Father McKinnon sat quietly cradling a glass of scotch, and after listening to me said, "Do you mind if we look into the cellar?" "I'll be honest with you, Sir David, I am sensitive in a spiritual manner, and I don't like what I am feeling at this moment." We then went down to where the room was discovered, and as he entered he staggered, apparently struggling to catch his breath, and gasped, "I know all there is to know. Please let us leave now." With assistance from both Father Horace and me, we helped him return to the safety of the lounge, where he quickly recovered from the experience. He sat quietly in deep contemplation, studying the flickering of the flames, and said, "Your ancestor, sir, enjoyed slaughtering innocents as well as warriors in battle. I make no apology for what perhaps my ancestors did in the past, but Sir Gilbert was a heathen, and sacrificed these poor souls, whose remains were found in that room, as an appeasement for Satan, whom he worshipped as an apostle for a secret brotherhood of knights that were founded in Jerusalem during the Crusades. This I know because he told me so while we went into that room of damnation and hell." He took a shot of whiskey from a glass and continued, "I have a gift that I regard as being from God, in the sense that I am what others describe today within certain circles as a medium. A few years ago I was like every other man until one day I performed the last rites to an elderly woman who practiced white witchcraft. She had what I discovered was a third eye, which allowed her to see and experience things that exist beyond this realm of reality. As she gasped her last breath, she held my hand and said, 'You are blessed, use it wisely.' She then died. I had no notion of whatever she was talking about until the following day, when I became aware of the existence of things beyond rational human understanding. In my church I would have been executed as a witch in times past, and only Father Horace knows of my gifts, which he too agrees are a divination from God, and nothing to be ashamed of. However, the mainstream church is not aware of this except for my successes in dealing with exorcisms, which today are regarded by some as complete nonsense. Therefore, I must share this with you, provided you promise as a gentleman that I have your word of honour." I was mesmerized by his words and said very affirmatively that my lips were sealed. He smiled, fell back into the seat of the sofa he was sitting upon, and asked for another scotch, which I willingly supplied. "Tomorrow," he continued, "we will learn more and deal with this. But I can tell you that when that wall was removed, not only were the souls of innocents released, but also those of the evil ones who had been tormenting them for centuries, and now they are loose in this house and must be sent back to the fiery depths of hell from whence they came." A terrified chill went down my spine, and Father Horace too looked shocked at his colleague's revelations. For a while longer, as he sat and mused on his tasks ahead, he explained that when he entered the room, he saw Sir Gilbert surrounded by ugly demonic entities who attempted to strangle him. Sir Gilbert hated the Scots with a passion, and he admitted that his tasks would be made more difficult because of that. He warned me to be wary during the night and suggested that we all sleep together in the lounge within a protected circle, blessed with holy water and an incantation ritual of protection, because Sir Gilbert would use force to attack and dislodge us. Having agreed to all of that, I simply could not believe that any of this was real in the modern era of the 20th century. But, on the other hand, I felt I could trust Father McKinnon, who was quite a rational man, and I had a deep faith and trust in his beliefs, which I admit I had never experienced for myself. That night Father Horace and I slept on bunk beds, while Father McKinnon slept on the three-seater sofa. Before retiring to sleep, he drew a solid circle in chalk on the bare stone floor, with a protective Latin spell written within the circle's perimeter and a crucifix drawn in the centre. For half an hour both he and Father Horace read a protective spell from an ancient Egyptian book of the dead, which was followed by a Christian prayer in Latin before sprinkling holy water over the three of us, at the end of which he said, "There, it is done. We must remain in the circle until dawn. Anything you see or hear is not real, and despite your better judgment, you must ignore it." To be perfectly honest, I did not feel like I wanted to sleep, and yet oddly I did, because I was awoken at 3 a.m. by a strong gust of wind which blew into the circle. At the command of Father McKinnon, we stood in the centre of the circle, where we linked arms while facing each other. "Stand your ground and hold on tight," he shouted. "This is the first wave." Around the circle I saw what could best be described as a typhoon of energy made of many human forms and some devilish ones, which spun faster and faster in a grey smoky mass. The stench from this manifestation had me almost gasping for breath, but the good father held true to his faith, and it stopped. "Do not let go," he pleaded. "There will be more." And then the second wave appeared in the forms of children, begging for Sir Gilbert to let them go as he bloodily struck them with a broadsword, causing voluminous amounts of blood to spurt into the circle and upon our clothes. The children were pleading for help and stared at us, crying as he cut them to pieces while laughing maniacally as he did so. I wanted to help, whether real or not. I wanted to go to them, to stop this. Father McKinnon shouted again, "This is not real. This is the work of Satan, and you must ignore it. Look at me, look at me." And so we did, and it stopped, and the room was quiet again. Strangely, despite the typhoon and the later slaughter of the innocents, nothing outside the circle was disturbed or displaced. Still, a pervading sense of evil was palpable, a kind of heavy aroma of bad sweat and filth which would not go away. Father McKinnon and Father Horace looked visibly relieved after having to witness the display of evil that had manifested earlier. But with a cautionary word of warning, he said the worst was yet to come, and that we must be prepared for it. I said, "Do you know, Father, what that might be?" He replied rather glumly, "I don't, but it will be a powerful illusion which will test the thin line between the supernatural and the real. And despite whatever happens, we must link up as before and ignore it, for however real it may seem, it is a deception to step outside the circle of light." Sure enough, around an hour before dawn, the now burnt-out fireplace suddenly burst back into flame, and like a flamethrower, it propelled long spurts of fire into the room. Very quickly, the furniture and room around the circle burst into flame, and the air was thick with an acrid smoke that we were starting to inhale as the fire appeared to take hold, and the temperature was such that we could feel our skin and clothing beginning to burn. Suddenly, Father Horace shouted, "Can't you see? The house really is on fire. It is burning me. Can't you feel it?" Father McKinnon remained firm. "Just keep linked to each other as before, and we will be safe. As real as this feels, you are not harmed unless you step outside the circle." If the heat and the burning grew stronger with intensity, and Father McKinnon recited a prayer of protection over and over, which helped reduce the effects of what felt real as we saw the beams catch fire and the walls starting to collapse. I held firm, but Father Horace suddenly lost self-control and broke from the arm-length circle and screamed, "We're all going to die if we remain. I am leaving." We struggled to hold him, but we could barely breathe, and the intensity of the heat was making us feel that we were burning too. And so Father Horace easily broke free and ran out of the circle, where he quickly ignited and screamed in pain as the fire devoured him before falling in a clump on the floor, dead, as his body was blackened and burnt. At that moment the fire and the damage it caused suddenly disappeared, and the air and temperature returned to normal, except for Father Horace's now smouldering remains, which turned to ash and were blown away by a sudden draught. Father McKinnon burst into tears at the loss of his young friend and colleague, and having crossed himself, he stood still in the circle, saying a short prayer. He said, "We must remain until the light of the new day passes through the windows. We must stay in this circle. Do you understand?" I replied that I was shocked at what had happened and felt guilty for the loss of Father Horace. He assured me that this was nobody's fault except for Sir Gilbert, and we will be rid of him once the light comes. We both sat in silence for the next hour before Father McKinnon, looking saddened and glum at the loss of his friend, decided it was safe to leave. He put on his vestments while I was instructed to act in place for the lost priest, as I carried a large doctor's bag with him to the cellar. As we entered, he screamed, "I know you are hiding here, you vile demon, and I will be soon rid of you for eternity." We entered the room where he recited a prayer of removal and sprinkled the 4 walls, ceiling and floor with holy water, which caused the surfaces to burn like acid thrown onto it. He then opened his black bag and pulled out his copy of the Book of the Dead and recited passages of it in a Coptic dialect, which caused the walls to shimmer as though something was being expelled from within the stonework. A foul, acrid smell once more permeated, and a dark grey misty trail emanated from the walls and ceilings, forming into a grey misty human figure before dissipating into nothingness. With that the atmosphere changed and the air smelt clean and pure. Closing the book, he said, "There, it is done. He and his followers have been sent back to hell, and the innocents are finally free to move on. But at what cost?" He, fighting back tears, said, "I will have to leave the church after this. They will find it hard accepting any explanation, because in modern-day liturgical thinking of evil, the church has lost its way by not recognizing the presence of it, and perhaps more than ever it still needs to be fought. And in that regard I will continue this work." The house, he assured me, was cleansed completely, and that transposition of evil wrought by Sir Gilbert De Pomeroy was now destroyed. My family and I never did return to the family home. It was sold as a going concern, and 2 years later it was mysteriously destroyed in a fire. We returned to London, where we resettled in Pimlico, and I, now in my 90th year, conclude the final chapter in this story of my life. I hope that those victims of my ancestor have found peace, and that Father Horace in spirit lies within the protection of our Lord Jesus Christ. The end.